The dog lunged the moment the doors opened, teeth bared, a sound in his throat that wasn't a bark so much as a warning from something trained to kill. 3 staff members hit the wall. A vet tech dropped his clipboard and ran. The handler, a man built like a concrete post, couldn't pull him back. 70 pounds of military animal and 4 years of combat instinct, and nobody in that emergency room could get within 6 feet. Then a woman in scrubs walked out of the supply room, stained uniform, coffee in one hand. Nobody looked at her twice. She set the coffee down, crouched low, and the dog stopped. Before this story goes any further, if you've ever rooted for the person everyone wrote off, hit that like button right now. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss what happens next, because the stories we tell here don't pull punches. And drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to the moment everything started to change. The morning shift at Harlow Peak Veterinary Trauma Center started the same way every morning started: understaffed, overcrowded, and held together by habit and bad coffee. It was a Tuesday in early November, the kind of cold that came in off the Rockies and settled into the bones of Denton Falls, Wyoming, like it intended to stay. The facility sat on the outer edge of town, sandwiched between a shuttered feed store and a stretch of highway that locals avoided after dark. It wasn't glamorous. The linoleum in the main corridor had been peeling at the corners since before Claire Maddox took the job, and the fluorescent light above the triage station had been flickering for 6 weeks and counting. Claire had learned to work under it without flinching. She'd learned to work under a lot of things. She was 34 and looked on most days like someone who hadn't slept quite enough and didn't particularly mind. Medium height, dark hair she kept pulled back with whatever elastic she found in her locker, a face that didn't give much away. The other staff had her filed under reliable but forgettable, which suited her fine. She showed up early, clocked out late, didn't complain, and did what she was told. Mostly. She had a habit of quietly fixing things that weren't her responsibility and saying nothing about it after. Dr. Philip Greer, the senior veterinarian on staff, had once described her to a colleague as adequate. He'd meant it as a neutral observation. Claire had overheard it and said nothing because there was nothing useful to say. She was restocking the trauma cart when the call came in at 7:42 a.m. Incoming animal emergency, handler in distress, K9 unit, no further information. She heard the radio crackle from the front desk and kept working. Tira Odom, the morning receptionist, poked her head around the corner. Sounds like military. Handler wouldn't give details. Said the dog won't let anyone near him. Which bay? Claire asked. They're not here yet. Maybe 10 minutes. Claire closed the cart, checked the inventory list she'd been running in her head, and noted they were short 2 units of saline and the suture kit in Bay 3 hadn't been restocked since Friday. She pulled a fresh kit from the cabinet and walked it down herself because waiting for someone else to do it meant it wouldn't get done before the patient arrived. By the time she got back to the main area, she could hear the vehicle pulling into the lot. The man who came through the door first was large, 6'2", maybe 6'3", wearing civilian clothes that didn't quite hide the posture underneath. Military, obviously, even without the identification he produced at the desk. His name was Sergeant First Class Damon Voss, retired. The dog he was trying to manage on the lead was a Belgian Malinois, maybe 80 pounds, dark fur across the back with that characteristic tan face, and the kind of controlled tension in every muscle that said the animal hadn't been fully off duty in years. The dog's name, according to the paperwork Voss shoved at Tira, was Kodiak. Kodiak did not want to be there. The moment the automatic doors sealed behind them, the dog planted all 4 feet and lowered his head. When Dr. Greer stepped forward with his hand extended in what he probably thought was a calming gesture, Kodiak's lip pulled back and the sound that came out made the vet tech behind Greer take 2 involuntary steps backward. Whoa! Okay. Greer raised his hands and retreated. He's been like this since I loaded him, Voss said. His voice was flat and controlled, the voice of a man who managed stress the way other people manage spreadsheets. But his jaw was tight, and his eyes were doing the thing that eyes did when someone was scared and refusing to show it. He doesn't go for people. This isn't normal. Any aggression history? Asked one of the vet techs, Marcus, from a safe distance near the wall. No. Voss's answer was immediate. He's been evaluated. He's never... He stopped. He looked at the dog. He's hurting. Something's wrong and he can't tell me where. Nobody moved. Greer looked at Marcus. Marcus looked at Tira. Tira looked at the door like she was calculating the distance. Claire had been standing near the supply room entrance the whole time, watching. She'd noticed the dog favoring his left rear leg the moment he walked in, a subtle thing, a fraction of a second's hesitation in his stride that she doubted anyone else had caught. She'd also noticed the way he held his spine, slightly rigid, not in the defensive arch of aggression, but in the careful stillness of something that hurts when it moves. She set down the inventory tablet she'd been holding and walked forward. Maddox, Greer said, and his tone carried the particular edge he used when he thought someone was about to do something idiotic. I'm not going to rush him, she said, without looking at Greer. She stopped about 8 feet from Kodiak and crouched down. Not the full crouch some people did, that instinct to make yourself small that animals could read as either submissive or predatory depending on the animal. She went to one knee, kept her posture neutral, her hands loose at her sides, and she didn't look at the dog directly. She looked at the floor about a foot to his left. Kodiak's growl dropped in pitch. Not gone. Still there, but lower. More like a question. There you go, Claire said quietly. It wasn't really directed at the dog. It was more like she was narrating something to herself. Voss hadn't moved. He was watching her the way someone watches a person diffuse something that could still go wrong. Claire waited. 30 seconds. The room was very quiet. Then she shifted her weight slightly, turning just enough to present her shoulder rather than her chest, and she reached her hand out, palm down, low to the ground. Kodiak sniffed the air. Then, with the reluctant deliberateness of an animal making a decision it wasn't entirely sure about, he took one step toward her. What is she doing? Marcus whispered to nobody. Voss said quietly, She's letting him choose. The dog reached her hand. He didn't lick it. He pressed his nose against it once, hard, and then he stood there, not relaxed exactly, but still. Not threatening. Present. Claire moved her hand slowly to his shoulder and ran it down his back. She felt the tension in the musculature, the slight flinch when she reached the junction of his lower spine, and she made a small sound under her breath that could have been acknowledgement. She looked up at Greer. He's got significant pain in the lumbar region, and based on how he was walking in, the way he compensated on his left rear, she paused. I think there's nerve involvement. Greer looked at her the way he always looked at her when she offered a medical opinion, like she'd suggested something mildly absurd that he was willing to tolerate for the sake of maintaining professional courtesy. We'll run a full exam when we can safely get him on the table. He'll let you near him now, Claire said. I appreciate that, but I'd like to make my own assessment of the... I'm not arguing with you, she said. I'm just telling you what I found. There was a beat of silence. Voss was looking at her, really looking, the way people looked when something didn't match the file they'd already built in their head. How did you do that? He asked. He doesn't let people near him, not even trainers he's worked with. He let me near him because he's exhausted, Claire said, standing. Animals in chronic pain reach a point where the cost of aggression is higher than the risk of contact. He's been guarding that injury for a long time. How long? She looked at the dog again. That's what I'd like to find out. The examination, once Kodiak had been safely maneuvered onto the padded table in Bay 2, took 40 minutes. Claire assisted. She was always assigned to assist, which was the role the facility had for her. She handed instruments, took notes, held animals steady, cleaned up after. She was not supposed to contribute diagnostic opinions, and she knew this because Dr. Greer had told her so 3 times in the past 2 months. She did it anyway. She did it quietly, specifically, and without fanfare. When Greer ran his hands down Kodiak's spine and reached the L4 to L5 region, the dog stiffened. Some sensitivity here, Greer said. Guarding response, Claire said. I see that. It's been consistent since he walked in. He adjusts his weight every... Maddox. She stopped. Greer continued his examination. He ordered x-rays. While they waited, Voss sat on the bench outside the bay with his elbows on his knees, and Claire passed by twice on legitimate errands and slowed her pace the second time because something in his posture made her stop. "When was his last military medical evaluation?" she asked. Voss looked up. 14 months ago, before retirement. And the evaluation cleared him as healthy? Completely. He said it like he'd already been turning it over in his head. Fit for civilian placement. Claire looked through the bay window at Kodiak, who was resting on the table with the particular stillness of an animal that had made peace with being handled. "The injury I'm seeing is not recent." Voss was very still. "What does that mean?" "It means—" She stopped, chose her words. "It means the damage was there 14 months ago." Neither of them said anything for a moment. "That's not possible," Voss said, but his voice said he'd already started considering that it was. The X-rays came back at 10:15 a.m. Greer studied them at the light panel in the main corridor, and Claire stood 2 feet behind him and looked at the same images. She didn't need him to narrate what she was seeing. The L4 to L5 region showed clear signs of degenerative disc involvement, and more than that, there was evidence of calcification around the joint that didn't happen overnight. That kind of structural change took months. The dog's nervous system had been compensating for it long enough to alter his gait permanently if it went untreated. "This is significant," Greer said, mostly to himself. "Yes," Claire said. "We're looking at surgical intervention, possibly referral to a specialist in Cheyenne or Denver," Claire said. "There are 2 facilities with the right imaging equipment and surgical experience for something this complex." Greer turned and looked at her with the patient expression of a man who found her very tiresome. "Thank you, Maddox. I'll make that determination." She nodded and said nothing. Voss, who had followed them out and was standing just behind the doorframe, stepped into the corridor. "What are you both looking at?" he asked. Greer hesitated. Voss had the particular quality of a man who didn't ask questions he didn't intend to get answered, and Greer seemed to read that correctly. He explained the findings in the measured, clinical way he used with clients, professional, stripped of anything that might sound like an accusation. But Voss wasn't listening to the clinical version. He was watching Claire. "You said the injury was there 14 months ago," Voss said to her. "I said the damage I'm seeing is not recent. The calcification pattern, when you said that, you meant the evaluation should have caught it." Claire met his eyes. "I meant what I said." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one I can give you right now." Greer looked between them with the expression of someone who'd wandered into a conversation that had moved past him. "We should focus on the treatment protocol." "Someone cleared him," Voss said, and his voice had gone very quiet. 14 months ago, someone signed off on an evaluation that said this dog was healthy, and he wasn't. The fluorescent light above the triage station flickered twice and held. "That's a serious allegation," Greer said. "That's a fact," Voss said, "based on what you just showed me." Claire had been watching Kodiak through the bay window. The dog had lifted his head and was looking toward them. Not alarmed, just attentive. She had a very specific feeling she recognized from a long time ago. The feeling of standing at the edge of something that was much bigger than it appeared from the outside, and knowing that stepping back wasn't going to make it smaller. "He needs imaging at a facility that can handle surgical planning," she said. "That's the immediate priority." "I agree," Voss said. "And after that, I need to understand how a dog with this level of injury passed a federal retirement evaluation." He said it to the room. But he was looking at Claire. And Claire, who had learned the hard way that some truths waited for exactly the right moment to surface, said nothing. She turned and walked back to the supply room, picked up her inventory tablet, and stood for a moment with her back to the corridor. Her hands were very steady. They were always steady. Even the morning in Kandahar, when the field station lost power and she'd performed triage by flashlight with 3 soldiers on the table and 2 more waiting. Even the night the report she'd filed about falsified animal evaluations got buried so deep inside a departmental inbox that it might as well have been shredded. Her hands had always been steady. She looked at the tablet without seeing it, and in the quiet of the supply room, with the smell of antiseptic and the distant sound of Voss's voice asking Greer for paperwork, she made a decision she'd been putting off for a long time. If Kodiak's evaluation had been falsified, he wasn't the first, and the person who'd signed off on it was going to have to answer for a lot more than one dog. The decision didn't feel dramatic. It felt like something settling into place after being slightly off kilter for a long time, the way a door fits its frame after the house shifts and resettles. Claire stood in the supply room for another 30 seconds, put the inventory tablet on the shelf, and walked back out into the corridor. Voss was still talking to Greer. He had a phone in his hand now and was scrolling through something with the focused efficiency of a man who'd already moved from the emotional part of the problem to the operational part. Greer was nodding with the particular rhythm of someone who had stopped fully listening. Claire went to the front desk and asked Tira for the intake forms Voss had submitted. "You need those for a reason?" Tira asked, not unkindly, but with the mild skepticism she applied to anything that deviated from standard procedure. "Documenting the case file," Claire said. "Dr. Greer wants everything current before the referral." It wasn't entirely a lie. Greer did want the referral paperwork in order. He just hadn't specifically asked Claire to handle it. But nobody at Harlow Peak was particularly precise about who did what, as long as it got done. And Claire had been quietly handling things that fell between job descriptions for 18 months. Tira handed over the folder. Claire took it to the small break room at the end of the east corridor, poured herself the coffee she'd abandoned 2 hours earlier, and opened the intake file. Damon Voss, age 41, retired SFC, military working dog handler, 8 years. Kodiak, MWD, designation K114, Belgian Malinois, 6 years old, retired from active service 14 months prior following a standard end-of-service medical evaluation conducted by a Dr. Raymond Sutter at the Fort Aldrin Military Veterinary Station in Nebraska. She read the name twice. Raymond Sutter. She knew that name, not because she'd worked with him directly, but because his signature had appeared on 3 separate animal evaluation reports that crossed her desk during her last year of service. Reports she'd flagged as inconsistent, then submitted through formal channels, then watched disappear into the administrative equivalent of deep water. She sat with that for a moment. The coffee had gone cold again. She drank it anyway. By noon, Greer had arranged for Kodiak to be transported to a veterinary surgical center in Casper that had the imaging and orthopedic surgery capacity to properly assess the disc involvement. Voss handled the logistics with the clipped precision of someone who'd coordinated field operations and found animal transport administratively straightforward by comparison. He signed forms, made calls, and moved with the efficient unhappiness of a man who was angry and choosing to express it through productivity. Claire was at the bay washing down the exam table when he appeared in the doorway. "They said you're not coming with him," Voss said. "I'm not on the surgical team. I'm intake and triage." "You're the only one here who actually knows what's wrong with him." She kept wiping the table. "Dr. Greer documented the findings. The surgical team in Casper will have everything they need." Voss was quiet for a moment. She could feel him working something out. "You knew about Sutter," he said. She stopped wiping. "When I mentioned the evaluation and you went to the front desk to pull the forms, you knew before I even told you his name." Claire turned around. "What makes you say that?" "Because you stopped moving. For about 3 seconds when I mentioned Fort Aldrin, you stopped moving. That's not how people react to information they're hearing for the first time." She looked at him. He wasn't accusatory. He was precise. There was a difference. "I served for 9 years," she said. "Military trauma nurse, field deployments, forward operating bases, and 18 months attached to a program that worked alongside military working dog units." He didn't look surprised. He looked like he'd suspected something in that direction and was now getting confirmation. "And Sutter?" "His name appeared on paperwork I saw during that time. Evaluations that I thought were inaccurate." "What happened to those evaluations?" She picked up the spray bottle and set it on the cart with more care than it needed. "Nothing," she said. "Nothing happened." He was still watching her. "You filed reports." "I did." "And?" "And I left the service 8 months later, and then I came here." She pushed the cart toward the door. He stepped aside to let her pass, then fell into step beside her, which she hadn't invited but didn't discourage. "If Sutter falsified Kodiak's evaluation," Voss said, "then he falsified others." "Probably." "How many?" "I don't know. When I flagged the ones I saw, I was working with a limited view. I didn't have access to his full caseload. but enough to file a formal report. 3 of them, she said, over 8 months. Voss let that sit for a moment. They'd reached the end of the corridor. He stopped walking. Why didn't anyone follow up? It was such a direct question that she almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because the answer was so obvious that the question felt almost innocent. Because the reports went to people who had reasons not to follow up, she said. I don't know the specific reasons. I know the result. He looked at the floor, then back up at her. I want to file a complaint. I know you do. And I want to know if you'll tell them what you just told me. The fluorescent light at the end of the corridor, a different one from the broken one at triage, this one just dim, made everything look slightly gray. Claire looked at Voss and thought about the 3 reports she'd filed, and the silence that had followed each one, and the particular loneliness of watching something true get swallowed by an institution large enough to digest it without noticing. If the right people ask me, she said, yes. The transport vehicle came for Kodiak at 2 in the afternoon. Before they loaded him, Claire crouched next to the dog one more time. He allowed it. He pressed his nose against her hand again, that same hard, deliberate contact, and she ran her palm down his flank and felt him exhale. You did good, she said. It was a stupid thing to say to a dog. She said it anyway. She watched the transport leave from the parking lot, and then she went back inside and finished her shift. The next morning, she arrived to find a vehicle in the lot that hadn't been there before. A government plate SUV, dark blue, parked with bureaucratic disregard for the lines. She noted it and went inside. Tara intercepted her at the door with the expression she used for significant events, which was an expression that made her look like she was suppressing genuine alarm beneath a professional veneer. There are 2 people here, she said quietly. They've been waiting since 8. They asked for you specifically. What kind of people? Suit people. One of them has a badge. I didn't get a good look, but it said federal something. Claire set her bag behind the front desk and walked to the waiting room. The 2 people were a man and a woman. The man was in his 50s, gray at the temples, a suit that fit like he'd worn versions of it every day for 20 years. The woman was younger, late 30s maybe, with the upright posture and careful eyes of someone who assessed rooms for a living. They both stood when Claire came in, which was either courtesy or an attempt to establish dominance through height, probably both. Claire Maddox? The man said. Yes. He produced credentials. His name was Special Agent Warren Holt, and his identification confirmed that he worked for the Defense Criminal Investigative Service. The woman was his counterpart, Agent Diane Farrell. We'd like to speak with you, Holt said. Privately, if possible. Claire looked at him, then at Farrell, then at the badge he was still holding. About what? About Raymond Sutter, Farrell said, and the reports you filed in 2019 and 2020, chet. They used Greer's office. Greer had been told about the meeting in that particular way that conveyed he wasn't being consulted so much as informed, and he'd retreated to Bay 1 with a combination of professional dignity and visible relief. The 3 of them sat around his desk, Holt and Farrell on one side, Claire on the other, the desk between them covered in Greer's half-organized paperwork and a ceramic mug that said, World's Okayest Vet. Holt opened a folder. You submitted 3 separate reports between February 2019 and November 2020 regarding what you described as irregularities in military working dog retirement evaluations signed by Dr. Raymond Sutter. Yes. Those reports were received by the Veterinary Course Administrative Office and subsequently forwarded to, he checked the page, the Regional Medical Review Panel in St. Louis. I know where they were forwarded. And then? And then nothing, Claire said. I received a form letter acknowledging receipt of each one. No further communication. Holt and Farrell exchanged something. Not a look exactly, more like a shared awareness passing between them. We're aware of that, Farrell said. We've been investigating Dr. Sutter's evaluation record for the past 7 months. What brought you to our attention was Sergeant First Class Voss's complaint filed yesterday afternoon. He works fast, Claire said. He's motivated, Farrell said without any particular inflection. What did you find? Claire asked. In 7 months, Holt closed the folder. We found 41 evaluations signed by Sutter over a 4-year period that contained documentation inconsistencies. Of those, we've been able to independently assess 17 retired animals. 12 of them have confirmed medical conditions that should have been identified at the time of evaluation. 12 animals. 12 dogs who had lived with pain that someone decided wasn't worth documenting. She kept her face even. And Sutter? He's currently suspended pending investigation, Farrell said. But we're not here to give you a status report on the case. We're here because your reports, the ones that went nowhere, are now the earliest documented evidence of the pattern, which means whatever you saw, whatever you documented in 2019 is potentially significant to a federal case. What are you asking me for? Everything you didn't put in the reports, Holt said. She looked at him. Why would I have held anything back? Because, Farrell said, people who file reports through official channels learn very quickly to give those channels only what they're prepared to act on, and sometimes they keep the rest somewhere else. It was a perceptive thing to say, and the precision of it made Claire slightly wary. These were people who understood how institutions managed inconvenient truth, which meant they were also people who operated inside the same institution, and that familiarity went in more than one direction. I kept notes, Claire said. Personal records. They're not official documents. We'd like to see them. I'd like to know why the reports were buried before I hand you anything. Holt sat back slightly. Farrell didn't move. That's part of what we're investigating, Farrell said. That's not an answer. No, Farrell agreed. It's not. But it's an honest non-answer, which is the best I can give you right now. Claire looked at the ceramic mug on the desk. World's okayest vet. Greer probably thought it was self-deprecating. She'd always thought it was accurate. Give me until tomorrow morning, she said. She drove home that evening through the early dark of a Wyoming November, the highway mostly empty, the mountains invisible beyond the tree line. The house she rented was a two-bedroom on the south end of Denton Falls that she'd chosen because it was cheap and private, and the nearest neighbor was far enough away that she could come home and not perform normalcy for anyone. She'd been in the house for 18 months. There were still boxes she hadn't unpacked. She went to the second bedroom, which she used as an office, and opened the closet. On the top shelf, behind a winter coat she hadn't worn since moving from Montana, there was a plastic storage box, the kind with the locking lid that came in packs of 3 from the hardware store. Inside the box were 7 manila folders and a portable hard drive. She sat on the floor with the box and went through everything. The folders held paper records, copies of the 3 official reports she'd filed, with her personal annotations in the margins. The form letters she'd received in response. Handwritten notes from conversations with other handlers and medics during her time at the Forward Support Battalions in Afghanistan, and later at the Joint Training Facility in Texas. Names, dates, specific observations about animals she'd assessed informally, outside official channels, because the official channels had already told her how they felt about her assessments. The hard drive held more. Digital copies of evaluation documents she'd been given access to as part of her duties, photographs of injury presentations she'd documented with her personal phone, and a series of emails from a conversation thread she'd had with a senior warrant officer named Priscilla Doubt, who had told her in January 2020 that her reports were making people uncomfortable, and that if she kept pushing, the discomfort would start accruing to her. Doubt hadn't been threatening her. She'd been warning her. There was a difference, and Claire had understood it at the time. She'd kept pushing anyway, filed the 3rd report in November 2020, and then, 6 months later, had separated from service with an honorable discharge and a vague official explanation about a reduction in force that she'd never entirely believed. She sat on the floor for a long time, going through pages she'd read so many times she could have narrated them from memory. The question wasn't whether to give Holt and Farrell the records. She'd already decided to do that. The question was whether she trusted that giving them the records would be different this time, whether the system that had swallowed her reports before had somehow changed enough to produce a different result. She didn't know. She didn't have enough information. But Kodiak had walked into that clinic that morning with a spine that had been quietly deteriorating for over a year, and somewhere in the federal administrative structure, a man named Raymond Sutter had been signing papers for 4 years that said animals like him were fine, and those papers had served some purpose that had nothing to do with the animals, and 12 dogs that Claire knew about, 12, and probably more, were carrying the proof of it in their bodies. She put everything back in the box. She was not going to let this disappear again. Boyd. She arrived at the facility at 7 the next morning, a full hour before Holt and Farrell were due, and found a message from Voss on her phone that had come in at 11 p.m. the previous night. Casper says the disc involvement is worse than the initial assessment. They want to do surgery next week. He's stable. Thank you. She read it twice, then put her phone away. Greer was already in when she arrived, which was unusual. He was in his office with the door partially closed, and she could hear him on the phone, his voice at the particular low volume people used when they didn't want to be overheard, but weren't in a position to be somewhere more private. She caught fragments. Her name. And then, she's been here 18 months, and I never had any reason to think, yes, I understand. No, I'm not suggesting anything. I'm just saying I don't know what She walked past his office and kept going. She sat up in the break room, arranged the folders and the hard drive on the table, and made a fresh pot of coffee. Then she sat and waited. Holt and Farrell arrived at 8 exactly. They came in together, accepted coffee without making a performance of it, and sat across from her at the break room table. Before we start, Claire said, I want to know something. Go ahead, Holt said. My reports were filed through official channels. They were received, acknowledged, and then functionally ignored. You told me yesterday you're investigating why, which means you already have a theory about why. I want to know what it is. Farrell looked at Holt. He looked at his coffee. Then he looked at Claire. We believe the reports were intercepted before they reached the review panel, he said. Not misdirected by error. Deliberately pulled. By who? That's what we're still determining. But someone inside the administrative structure, Claire said. Yes. Someone who had reason to protect Sutter's work. That's our working hypothesis. She sat with that. Someone had pulled her reports, not a system failure, not bureaucratic indifference. A person, or more than one person, who had seen her documentation, understood what it meant, and made an active decision to bury it, which meant they'd also made a decision about her. That she was manageable, that she'd get tired and stop pushing, that the cost of dealing with her was lower than the cost of dealing with what she was pointing at. They'd been right, for a while. Okay, she said. She pushed the folders across the table. This is everything I kept. Farrell opened the top folder immediately, with the focused efficiency of someone who'd been waiting for this. Holt picked up the hard drive and turned it over in his hands. The drive has a password, Claire said. I'll give it to you. But I want it on record that this material was compiled over my objections to the formal process. I'm not providing it to the investigation. I'm providing it because 12 animals, that you know about, were hurt by this, and there are more you don't know about yet. Holt looked up from the drive. We'll document that. I'm not asking for credit, she said. I'm asking you to understand what this is. This isn't evidence someone saved for leverage. This is what a person keeps when they know they're not going to be believed, so at least they'll be able to say they had proof. Farrell had stopped reading. She was looking at Claire with an expression that was harder to categorize than Holt's, something between professional assessment and the look people gave when someone said something that landed harder than expected. We understand that, Farrell said. Make sure your supervisors understand it too. She pushed the hard drive password across the table on a slip of paper. By 10 in the morning, Holt and Farrell had set up a temporary working space in the conference room that Harlow Peak used for staff meetings and occasionally to store overflow supplies. They brought a laptop and spent 2 hours going through Claire's documentation with the methodical attention of people who understood that the value of a 7-year-old record was in the specific, not the general. Claire worked her regular shift. She restocked bays, assisted Marcus with a retriever that had swallowed something it shouldn't have, ran blood work results to Greer, and did not discuss the federal investigators with anyone, because she hadn't been asked to keep it confidential and therefore didn't see the need to announce it. At noon, Farrell found her in the corridor. We need to ask you about a name, Farrell said. It appears in your notes several times. Whose? Colonel Marcus Aldridge. Claire's hands were steady. They were always steady. But something happened behind her sternum that wasn't quite calm. He was the commanding officer of the Regional Veterinary Support Battalion during the period I was flagging the evaluations, she said. Your notes suggest you believed he was aware of your reports. I believed his office received copies, standard routing. Did you ever speak to him directly? Once, in March 2020. She paused. He told me that my concerns had been reviewed and that the evaluators in the program were highly qualified professionals. He said it in the specific way that people say things when they want you to know the conversation is over. Farrell wrote something in her notebook. And Aldridge. Do you know his current position? Claire looked at her. No, why? Farrell didn't answer immediately. She wrote something else, then looked up. He's currently the Deputy Director of Military Animal Program Administration, she said. He oversees the entire evaluation and retirement process for military working dogs, nationally. The corridor was very quiet. That's why my reports went nowhere, Claire said. It wasn't a question. It's a significant lead, Farrell said carefully. It's why my reports went nowhere, Claire said again, because she was not going to let the careful language obscure what it meant. He was in the routing chain when I filed them, and he spent the last 4 years in a position that gave him control over the same system I was trying to flag. Farrell held her gaze. Yes, she said, that's what it looks like. Claire turned that over for a moment. Not with surprise. She was past the point where surprise was useful here, but with the particular weight of understanding that the wall she'd been pushing against for years had a name, and that name had a title. And that title had an office in a building somewhere that was currently unaware that 2 federal agents were sitting in a Wyoming veterinary clinic reading documents that had been waiting 7 years for exactly this moment. She was about to say something when her phone buzzed. She looked at it. A text from a number she didn't recognize. A Wyoming area code. A message that was only 11 words long. You should stop cooperating, for your own sake. You don't understand what you're holding. She showed the phone to Farrell without saying anything. Farrell read it. Her expression didn't shift much, but her jaw tightened in the particular way that indicated she was recalibrating something. When did this come in? Just now, while we were talking. Don't respond. Farrell pulled out her own phone and stepped back. Holt, she said into it, we have a complication. Claire looked at the message again. You don't understand what you're holding. Which was interesting because she understood exactly what she was holding. That was the part that had always been the problem. She locked her screen and put the phone in her pocket and went back to work. Because there was a post-op retriever in Bay 1 who needed his drain checked, and the world didn't stop moving because someone had decided to remind her that she was standing on dangerous ground. She'd known she was standing on dangerous ground. She'd known it since 2019. The message just meant that someone else knew she knew, which meant the records she'd handed over were more significant than even she'd understood. She changed the drain, noted the output, and wrote it in the chart with the same handwriting she used for everything. Holt ran the number inside of an hour. He came to find her at the medication cabinet, with the look of someone who'd gotten an answer that created more questions. Prepaid, he said. Purchased at a convenience store in Rawlins 6 days ago. Cash transaction. Rawlins is 4 hours south, Claire said. Someone drove to a different city, bought a throwaway and sat on it for 6 days before using it, he said. That's not a panicked decision. That's a planned one. Which means they knew about the investigation before today. Or they've been watching you specifically. He let that sit for a moment. Is there anyone at this facility who might have alerted someone to the agent's presence this morning? She thought about Greer's phone call, his voice through the partially closed door. She's been here 18 months and I never had any reason to think. I don't know, she said, because she didn't know, not for certain, and she wasn't going to hand Holt a name based on a fragment of overheard conversation. Holt nodded like that was the answer he'd expected. We're going to move faster than we planned, he said. The records you provided give us enough to formalize the investigation. We're bringing in 2 more agents from Denver, and we're going to want you available for a formal recorded interview, say, probably day after tomorrow. I can do that. In the meantime, if you receive any further contact from that number, or any number, forward it to Farrell immediately. And if anything feels wrong, I'll let you know, she said. He started to leave. She said, Aldridge knows. Holt turned back. The message came through while Farrell was telling me his name, Claire said. That's not a coincidence. Someone in this building or someone watching this building reported back to someone within the hour. Aldridge has a source somewhere in this chain. Holt looked at her steadily. We're aware of that possibility. I'm not asking if you're aware of it. I'm telling you to factor it into what you share and with whom. He was quiet for a moment. We'll be careful. Be more than careful, she said, because if he's had 4 years to build insulation around himself, he has practiced people in practiced positions, and careful isn't always enough. She turned back to the medication cabinet. Behind her, she heard Holt leave without responding, which was either professional restraint or acknowledgement. Probably both. The 2 additional agents arrived from Denver the following morning in a second SUV, and by Thursday afternoon, the conference room at Harlow Peak had been quietly converted into a working field office that the rest of the staff navigated around with varying degrees of discomfort. Marcus started taking his lunch breaks at a sandwich place down the road. Tira asked Claire 3 times if everything was okay and seemed unsatisfied by Claire's consistent confirmation that it was. Greer stopped initiating conversations with Claire altogether, which was almost an improvement from the previous dynamic. The formal interview happened Thursday afternoon. Holt and Farrell ran it together, a 3rd agent operating the recording equipment. They went through Claire's service record, her timeline at the forward support battalions, her documentation of the evaluation concerns, her conversations with Warrant Officer Doubt, and her singular meeting with Colonel Aldridge in March 2020. It took 4 hours. Claire was precise. She gave them dates, locations, specific language from conversations she'd written down within hours of them happening. She'd started keeping contemporaneous notes in 2019 when she realized the formal system wasn't going to serve her, a habit she'd developed in the field, where after-action records were the difference between understanding what went wrong and repeating it. When they reached the meeting with Aldridge, Farrell leaned forward slightly. You said he told you that the evaluators were highly qualified professionals, Farrell said. What exactly were those words? He said, the professionals in this program are among the most qualified in military medicine. I find it difficult to understand how a staff nurse with your level of experience believes she's identified a systemic problem that dozens of trained evaluators have missed. The room was quiet except for the soft record light on the camera. He used the phrase staff nurse, Farrell said. He used it 3 times in a 7-minute conversation. To establish your level in the hierarchy relative to his. To tell me what I was, Claire said, and what I wasn't. Farrell wrote something. Holt looked at his folder. The recording ran. After that conversation, Holt said, did you file the 3rd report? 8 months later, yes. Even knowing how Aldridge had characterized the first 2. Yes. Why? Claire looked at him. It was a genuine question. She could tell because it wasn't in the folder, wasn't part of the structured interview flow. He actually wanted to know. Because an animal can't file its own report, she said. And I couldn't stop seeing what I'd seen just because he'd made it clear I wasn't supposed to have seen it. Oh. She drove home Thursday evening and did not feel the relief she'd expected to feel. She'd expected something, some release that came from handing the weight of 7 years to people who had the authority and apparatus to do something with it. Instead, she felt alert in the jittery, unpleasant way she'd felt during night watch in Afghanistan. The particular vigilance of someone who knew that the current moment of quiet was not the same as safety. She ate dinner and went through the routine of her house. Dishes, locks, the particular sequence of habits she'd settled into here that she'd never quite recognized as a routine until she was doing it and realized she'd done it the same way for 18 months. There was something both comforting and depressing about that. At 9:15, her phone rang. Voss. Casper says surgery is moved to Monday, he said. They want to wait for additional imaging results. That's standard, Claire said. They want to be precise about the decompression approach before they open. He's not comfortable. A pause. He keeps looking for me through the kennel door. She sat with that for a moment. He'll be okay, she said. He's been managing that pain for over a year. 4 more days is manageable. I know. He paused again. How's the situation with the investigators? Moving forward? Can you tell me anything? Not much, but more than I could have told you last week. He seemed to understand that was as much as she had. I heard there's a name, someone above Sutter. Where did you hear that? Holt mentioned it wasn't just a single evaluator when he called to update me this afternoon. Claire made a note of that. Holt had mentioned Aldridge's level to Voss, which meant Holt either trusted Voss completely or was using him as a channel for information, and she wasn't sure which was more concerning. Don't repeat it, she said. I won't. A beat. Claire, are you okay? The question landed differently than she expected. People asked it as a social formula. The way Voss asked it had a different quality. The specificity of someone who'd spent years in environments where the answer to that question actually mattered. I'm cautious, she said. That's different from okay, but it's functional. Fair enough, he said. Call me if something changes. She said she would, and meant it, and went to bed at 10 and lay awake until after midnight listening to the wind off the mountains. Friday brought an escalation she hadn't anticipated. She was on shift at 7, processing a routine intake, when Farrell found her at the front desk with the clipped urgency that distinguished actual emergency from procedural importance. My office, Farrell said, which meant the conference room, and she said it quietly enough that Tira looked up from her computer and then looked away. Inside, Holt was standing. He didn't sit when Claire came in, which was unusual. Farrell closed the door. Sutter's attorney made contact with the DCIS field office in Colorado this morning, Holt said. He's offering cooperation. Full disclosure of the evaluation process, names involved, documentation of instructions he received. That's good, Claire said. He's attaching conditions, Farrell said. One of the conditions is that the investigation formally acknowledge that certain reports filed against his client's practice were received and reviewed by the program administration and deemed non-credible, and that this determination was made at a supervisory level, not by Sutter. Claire understood what that meant before Farrell finished saying it. He's trying to establish that the system signed off on what he was doing, that he had authorization. Effectively, yes. He wants documented evidence that your reports were reviewed and rejected on their merits. But they weren't reviewed at all. They were pulled. We know that, Holt said. But his attorney is claiming there's documentation of a review, signed forms, an official record of an internal assessment that found the reports lacked sufficient basis for investigation. That documentation didn't exist when I filed. It was created, Farrell said, apparently within the last 6 months. The dates on the records correspond to the original filing periods, but the metadata says otherwise. The fluorescent lights in the conference room were functional, all of them, and the room felt very bright. Claire looked at the table between them. Someone manufactured a paper trail that makes it look like my reports were properly reviewed and dismissed. In the last 6 months, which is when Sutter knew you were investigating him. That's correct. And the documents are designed to make my reports look like they were considered and found wanting, which doesn't just protect Sutter. It makes me look like someone who filed inaccurate complaints and then lied about how they were handled. Yes, Holt said, that's the mechanism. She sat back in the chair. The calculation was clear and she could see it working from both ends. Sutter's cooperation was valuable to the investigation, but the price of that cooperation was a version of events in which the reports Claire had filed were legitimate institutional feedback rather than inconvenient truths that someone chose to suppress. If DCIS accepted that framing, the investigation got Sutter but absorbed his cover story. Aldridge's 4-year construction survived, and Claire's credibility, which was currently the foundation of the case's early timeline, became permanently contested. He's not just trying to protect himself, she said. Someone told him to build that version, someone who knew the investigation had found my records and needed to preemptively neutralize them. Farrell nodded slowly. Aldridge, Claire said. Neither agent confirmed it, neither had to. Your personal records, Holt said. The contemporaneous notes, the photographs, the email thread with doubt. They predate any of the manufactured documentation by years. That's significant. It is, Claire said, but only if the manufactured documents can be proven fake. The metadata is recoverable. Our forensics team is already on it. How long? Days, maybe less. She thought about that. Days was a long time for someone who'd just learned that a federal attorney was actively trying to reframe 7 years of her life as a pattern of inaccurate complaints. She thought about Aldridge, who had told her in a 7-minute conversation in 2020 that she was a staff nurse and should understand her place, and had apparently spent the intervening years building backup systems for exactly this moment. "What do you need from me?" she asked. "The email thread with Doubt," Farrell said. "You mentioned it on the drive. We need the original files, the headers, the full thread, the server routing information, if you have it." "I have the email archive. I exported it when I separated from service. Original headers included." "We need that today." She stood up. "I'll get you the drive." She went home on her lunch break, which she never did, and pulled the backup drive from the locked drawer in her desk. It was smaller than the one she'd given them before. A flat drive the size of a deck of cards, labeled in her handwriting with a date and the single word personal. She sat at her desk for a moment before leaving. The emails from Dowett were there, but so was something she hadn't mentioned to Holt or Farrell because she hadn't been certain it was relevant, and she'd learned a long time ago not to give investigators more than they were ready to use. In the email thread, in an exchange from March 2020, the same month she'd met with Aldridge, Doubt had written something that Claire had read a dozen times and still found difficult to fully parse. "You need to understand that the program you're looking at isn't just Sutter. There are procurement contracts attached to the retirement evaluations. Healthy animals get placed with specific vendors. There is money moving through this that has nothing to do with veterinary medicine. I'm telling you this because I'm telling you to be careful, not because I'm going to help you. Procurement contracts. Vendors. Healthy animals placed with specific vendors." She had understood the corruption as a medical failure. Evaluators falsifying health records to avoid the cost of treating injured animals, to ease the administrative burden of retirement processing. That version of the story had an ugly logic to it, the institutional logic of cutting corners in ways that were deniable and diffuse. But Doubt's email suggested something that was colder and more deliberate. If the retirement evaluations were connected to placement contracts, if animals being certified as healthy were being directed to specific receiving organizations or private vendors, then the falsification wasn't just about what was hidden, it was about what was sold. She'd held that email for 4 years without knowing what to do with it. She picked up the drive and left. She handed it to Farrell at 2 p.m. and said, "The Doubt thread. Read the March 17th, 2020 exchange before you look at anything else." Farrell took the drive with the quiet efficiency she applied to everything. "Anything I should know going in?" "Read it first," Claire said, "and then come find me." She went back to work. She assisted with a spinal post-op assessment on a border collie, restocked the IV station, and was writing up notes in the East Corridor when Farrell appeared at the far end of it 40 minutes later. She walked toward Claire with a specific quality in her movement, not hurried, but compressed, the way people moved when they were holding something significant and didn't want to be seen holding it. "The vendor placement angle," Farrell said, when she was close enough. "You knew about this." "I knew Doubt mentioned it. I didn't know if it was operationally significant or speculation." "It's operationally significant," Farrell said. "We've been looking at the evaluation fraud as a cost avoidance scheme. This changes the structure of what we're looking at." "By how much?" Farrell was quiet for a moment. "If there's a procurement layer, if animals are being evaluated, certified, and then directed to contracted placement partners as part of a structured agreement, we're not looking at a few falsified forms. We're looking at a supply chain, which means federal contracting law, potentially wire fraud, and a financial trail that goes significantly further than Sutter's signature on evaluation documents." Claire had understood that in abstract terms for 4 years. Hearing it stated in specific legal categories made it more real and more frightening simultaneously. "Aldridge would have had to authorize the vendor contracts," she said. "Or someone above him." She hadn't thought past Aldridge. "How far up does this go?" Farrell looked at her with the particular honesty that agents sometimes produced when the situation had outgrown their prepared answers. "We don't know yet," she said, "but we're going to find out. And in the meantime, Sutter's attorney is still negotiating a cooperation deal that protects that structure. We're going to move on that today. The negotiation gets paused until we can assess what Sutter actually knows about the placement contracts." Claire nodded. She looked down the corridor at the ordinary machinery of the clinic, the carts, the supply cabinets, the afternoon light coming through the window at the end. Someone is going to try to stop this, she said. It wasn't alarmism, it was a read of the pattern. We're taking precautions. That's not what I mean. She looked at Farrell. Sutter's attorney moved this morning. The threat text came yesterday. Someone is managing the timeline from the outside, and they're moving faster now because they know about the records I gave you. At some point, they're going to decide that slowing the investigation down isn't sufficient. Farrell held her gaze. Are you concerned about your personal safety? I'm concerned about the integrity of the evidence, Claire said. Me specifically is secondary. It's not secondary to us. It might need to be, Claire said, because if Dowd's email is right, what we're looking at is bigger than one retired dog and one falsifying evaluator and one senior officer protecting a subordinate. And the people who built something that size don't take risks lightly. They take them precisely. Farrell was about to respond when Holt appeared at the end of the corridor, phone in hand, moving with an urgency that was different from his baseline. We have a problem, he said when he reached them. He looked at Claire, and the look had an apology in it that she didn't like. The backup copies of your documentation, the physical folders you gave us Tuesday, they were in the evidence lockbox in the conference room. Claire felt the cold arrive before the next sentence did. The lockbox wasn't broken into, Holt said. It was opened with a key. Someone with authorized access to that room removed the folders between 11 and 2 this afternoon. The corridor felt suddenly very still. The hard drives? Claire asked. Still there. Whoever took the folders either didn't know about the drives or took what they could reach quickly. He paused. The drive you gave Farrell this afternoon is secure. But the folders are gone, Claire said. Yes. She thought about what was in the folders. The paper copies of the 3 filed reports, her handwritten annotations, the form letter acknowledgments, her contemporaneous notes. 7 years of careful documentation, gone from a room in a building where she worked, taken by someone who had authorized access to a federal evidence lockbox. Aldridge has someone inside the investigation, she said. Holt didn't deny it. We're treating it that way. Then anything you know, he knows. And he knows what's on those drives, even if he doesn't have them, which means he knows about the Doubt email and the vendor contracts. Farrell's jaw was tight. Holt was looking at his phone. He's not going to let this get to the procurement layer, Claire said. He can absorb Sutter. He might even be willing to absorb his own role in the evaluation cover-up. But if the financial structure comes out, if there's a federal contracting trail with his name or anyone senior to him on it, that's a different magnitude of consequence. We know, Holt said. Then you know what comes next, Claire said. He's going to reframe the investigation before it can get to that level, and the easiest way to do that is to make this about me. She said it plainly, without drama, because it was the obvious tactical move, and she'd seen it before, in smaller contexts, in smaller institutions, and the logic didn't change with scale. He'll use the manufactured review documents, Farrell said. He'll use everything, Claire said. The manufactured documents, whatever's missing from those folders, my separation from service, which I promise you doesn't look clean from the outside even though it was. He'll construct a version of events where a disgruntled former nurse with a history of filing inaccurate complaints inserted herself into a federal investigation and contaminated the evidence base. Holt looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully categorize. We're not going to let that happen. You might not have a choice, she said, if he moves fast enough and you don't move faster. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. A different number this time. A Denver area code. A message, 2 sentences. The review board has been notified of concerns regarding the credibility of a key witness in the DCIS investigation into military veterinary evaluation practices. An emergency session has been convened for Monday morning. She handed the phone to Holt. He read it. Farrell read it over his shoulder. The review board, Monday morning, which was the same day as Kodiak's surgery, which was a coincidence that wasn't a coincidence at all. Someone had chosen that date because they understood that Voss would be in Casper, distracted, unavailable to speak to anyone on her behalf. and a review board convened on emergency grounds with concerns about a key witness's credibility had the authority to pause an active federal investigation pending resolution of those concerns. 4 years of building, 4 years of insulation. And now the walls were closing in from 3 directions simultaneously. He's not trying to stop the investigation, Claire said very quietly. He's trying to stop me specifically. Remove the witness. Collapse the timeline. Let Sutter take a plea that doesn't touch the contracts. And walk away. Holt was already on his phone, stepping away from them down the corridor. Farrell looked at Claire with the direct, leveled attention of someone who had stopped managing the situation and started being inside it. The drives are secured, she said. The Doubt email is secured. What else do you have that isn't on paper? What do you know that you haven't given us yet? Claire looked at her for a long moment, and then she said, I know who else Doubt told. Farrell went very still. Who? Her name is Priscilla Doubt, Claire said. Warrant officer, retired. She sent me that email in March 2020 and then went quiet. I assumed she'd made the calculation that self-preservation was the smarter move, which was fair. It probably was. But she sent it to me, which means she sent it to someone. People like Doubt don't put things in writing to one person. You think she documented it separately? I think she's been sitting on something for 4 years waiting for a reason to use it, the same way I was. Farrell was already moving toward the conference room. Do you have contact information for her? Last address I had was Tucson. She separated from service 6 months after I did. Claire followed her. She may not cooperate. She warned me, not because she wanted to help, because she wanted me to stop. But that email exists for a reason, and if she kept what she said she'd found, the procurement trail has a second source. I need everything you have on her, Farrell said. I'll write it down. She did. Sitting at the conference room table with Farrell's legal pad and a pen, she wrote Doubt's name, her last known Tucson address, the phone number that had stopped working in 2021, and the name of the unit Doubt had transferred to before separation. She wrote it cleanly, without commentary, and pushed the pad across the table. Holt came back in while she was doing it. He was off his phone, and he had the look of someone who had made several decisions in rapid succession and was now executing them with the calm that followed commitment. We're requesting an emergency stay on the review board session, he said, on grounds that it was initiated using information obtained through a breach of investigative evidence. That'll take time, Claire said. We have a federal judge in Cheyenne who's been briefed on the investigation. If we file tonight, we have a reasonable chance of a temporary hold by Sunday evening. And if you don't get it, then we make sure Monday morning's session doesn't have a clean shot at you. He looked at the pad where she'd written Doubt's information. Is she credible? She was a warrant officer with a clean record and 17 years of service. She saw the same thing I saw, and she's been quiet for 4 years, which means she's credent enough to be frightened of what she knows. Claire stood up. She's credible. We'll find her tonight. Claire gathered herself and went back out to the corridor. She had 3 hours left on her shift. She worked them, mopped. Saturday passed with the particular tension of a situation moving fast in places she couldn't see. Holt called twice. Once to tell her the federal judge had received their filing, once to tell her Doubt had been located in Tucson and had agreed to a phone interview that afternoon. He didn't tell her what Doubt had said, and she didn't ask, because she understood that the investigation had its own logic now, and her role in it was as a source, not a participant. Voss called at noon. Surgery's prepped for Monday, 6 a.m. Good, she said. Casper? Yeah, I'm driving down Sunday night. A pause. I heard something's happening with the investigation. One of the agents called me to confirm my schedule. Confirming you'd be in Casper Monday. That's what they said. His voice was careful. Is that relevant to something? Probably just standard. She didn't believe that and suspected he didn't either, but there was nothing productive in explaining to him that the timing of his absence had been factored into someone's strategy for dismantling the case. Is there anything I should know? He asked. Not yet, she said. How's Kodiak? Anxious, they say that's normal pre-op. It is. He knows something's happening. They always know. Another pause, longer. You sound tired. I'm fine. That wasn't what I said. She almost smiled. I'm tired and fine. They're not mutually exclusive. He let it go. She appreciated that. After she hung up, she sat in her kitchen with the specific restlessness of someone waiting for something to break in one direction or another. She was not a person who did well with uncertainty. She managed it. She'd gotten practiced at sitting inside it without unraveling. But she didn't do well with it. She preferred problems that had tractable surfaces. Give her a spinal assessment, a contaminated wound, a pressure response going wrong in the field, and her mind went quiet and clear. Give her 4 federal agents working an investigation in a state she couldn't fully see, and she had to work to keep herself from filling the gaps with catastrophe. She went for a run instead. 3 miles through the streets of Denton Falls in the November cold, past the gas station and the shuttered hardware store and the elementary school with its weekend quiet, and when she came back, she felt marginally more like herself. Sunday morning brought the federal judge's ruling. Holt called at 7:15. Temporary hold granted. The review board session is stayed pending investigation into the evidence breach. That buys us at least 72 hours. And doubt? A pause that told her something significant before he said anything. She has documentation, he said. Financial records. She worked briefly in the contracting office before she transferred to the unit you both served in, and she held on to copies of 3 procurement agreements from 2018 and 2019 that established direct payment structures between the Military Animal Program Administration and 2 private placement organizations. Claire sat down. She's had those for 6 years. She has. She says she kept them because she didn't know what to do with them, and she was afraid of what would happen if she did. Apparently your records going nowhere confirmed that fear. She saw what happened to me. Yes. She said... He stopped, like he was reading something. She said she watched you file 3 reports and get nothing, and she concluded that whoever was protecting the structure was too embedded to be moved by internal process. She was waiting for external pressure. The DCIS investigation. When I called her yesterday and told her what we had, she sent us a scanned copy of the procurement documents within an hour. Claire looked out her kitchen window at the street. The 2 placement organizations, she said. Do they connect to Aldridge? One of them has a board member who served under Aldridge at Fort Aldrin before transitioning to private sector. The financial relationships aren't direct. There's a layer of contracting vehicles between the program and the organizations, but the paper connects. You can trace it. Our forensics team thinks yes, it takes time, but the architecture is there. She thought about Aldridge in 2020, his 7-minute conversation about what she was and what she wasn't, and how confident he'd been, how entirely certain that she was manageable, that the cost of dealing with her was lower than the cost of what she'd found. He'd been right. For 4 years, he'd been right. What do you need from me today? She asked. Nothing urgent. Stay available. And, Claire, he paused, I want you to know that the evidence base we're building now doesn't depend on your testimony the way it did on Thursday. The doubt documents, the metadata on the fabricated records, the procurement architecture, that's 3 independent lines of corroboration. Even if the review board somehow moved forward and challenged your credibility, the case has structural support that doesn't require you to be the foundation. She recognized that he was trying to give her something. She sat with it. Thank you, she said, because it was the right thing to say, and because she meant it, even though she also knew that no case was ever as clean as its best moment, and the 72-hour window could close in directions neither of them could fully predict. Quote, Monday happened in pieces. She was in her kitchen at 5:45 when Voss texted, heading in, he's calm, thank you for everything. She made coffee and read it twice and felt something that wasn't quite relief but was adjacent to it. The particular quality of caring about an outcome that you have no control over. At 7:15, Farrell called. The forensics team has confirmed the metadata on the fabricated review documents. The files were created in the last 8 months, with timestamps artificially backdated. The document templates used are consistent with official DCIS forms, which indicates whoever created them had access to internal government document systems. Aldridge's office. We can't say that definitively yet, but the access level required narrows the field significantly. What are you doing with it? Filing this morning, we're submitting a formal request to expand the investigative scope to include procurement fraud and federal contracting violations, and we're requesting authorization to interview Aldridge directly. He'll have counsel. He already does. His attorney contacted us Sunday night. A pause. He's cooperating. That stopped her. What? His attorney called Sunday night and indicated that Colonel Aldridge is prepared to provide a full accounting of his role in the administrative suppression of complaints regarding Sutter's evaluation practices. He's not offering cooperation on the procurement side. He's drawing a line. He's trying to. He'll give us the cover-up of the evaluation fraud, accept responsibility for suppressing the reports, and hope that separates him from the financial structure. Claire understood the calculation immediately. Because the evaluation suppression is one set of consequences. Federal procurement fraud is another magnitude entirely. Correct. And his attorney thinks if he concedes the first, he can argue the second was beyond his knowledge. That's the play. She thought about the procurement documents Doubt had held for 6 years, the payment structures, the board member who'd served under Aldridge and then transitioned into private sector. He's wrong, she said. We think so too, Farrell said, but proving it requires finishing the financial trace. And that takes time we need to buy. How do you buy it? We accept the interview request, listen to what he gives us on the suppression, and don't signal what we have on the contracts until we're ready to use it. It was a standard investigative approach. Let the subject believe they've drawn the line in the right place. And if his attorney moves faster than your forensics team? That's the risk, Farrell said. Yes, Chet. She went to work at 8. There was a shepherd mix in Bay 2 recovering from an intestinal surgery, a pair of terriers with Bordetella who needed monitoring, and a Labrador intake for a suspected ACL tear that arrived at 9 with a family of 4, including 2 children who were very upset in the specific way children were upset when they understood something was wrong, but not exactly what. Claire talked to the kids while Marcus got the dog settled, which wasn't in her job description, and which she'd been doing unconsciously for 18 months. Is she going to be okay? The older one asked. About 9. A girl, very serious in the way of children who'd appointed themselves the designated worrier. She's going to need surgery, Claire said, but dogs recover from this well. She'll be running again in a few months. You promise? She looked at the girl. I promise she's going to get the best care we have. It wasn't a yes, and the girl knew it wasn't a yes, but she nodded with the solemn pragmatism of someone learning to accept qualified reassurance, which was maybe the most important thing a 9-year-old could learn. Greer came to find her at 10, which required him to be the one to initiate, which cost him something she could see him paying. The federal investigators, he said. How long? I don't know, she said. The staff is unsettled. I understand. He was quiet for a moment. In the fluorescent quiet of the East Corridor, he looked like a man who had spent the past week realizing that the mental file he'd maintained on Claire Maddox was significantly incomplete. You should have told me, he said. Told you what? That you had a background in whatever it is you have a background in. It wasn't relevant to the job, she said. It's clearly relevant to whatever this is. This, she said, is something that existed before I came here and has nothing to do with how I do my job here. She paused. But you're right that I could have been more forthcoming. I'm not particularly good at that. He looked like he wanted to say something more and couldn't find the right shape for it. Are you in trouble? He asked finally. It was a more direct question than she expected from him. Not in the way you mean, she said. He nodded once, turned around and went back to his office. She watched him go and thought that adequate, as an assessment, went in more than one direction. Tick. The call from Holt came at 2:15. She was in the break room eating the lunch she'd delayed 3 hours, and she answered on the second ring. Aldridge came in this morning, Holt said. Sat down with us for 4 hours. And? He gave us the suppression chain on the evaluation reports. Everything. The routing system he set up to intercept complaints before they reached the review panel. The specific cases he pulled. The instructions he gave to his administrative staff. He admitted to creating a false review process that generated bogus acknowledgement letters and filed manufactured assessment records going back to 2017. Not just mine. Not just yours. 37 complaints over 7 years. Yours were 3 of them. 37. She sat with that number. 37 times, someone inside the system had noticed something wrong, done the thing they were supposed to do, and been absorbed without consequence. Did he give you Sutter? He confirmed that Sutter was operating under implicit authorization. Not written orders, Aldridge was careful about that, but a structure in which Sutter understood that his evaluations would not be scrutinized and his certifications would be accepted without secondary review. And the procurement contracts? He denied knowledge. Holt's voice had a specific flatness when he said it. He says the placement organizations operated independently and that his role was limited to the evaluation administration side. He says he has no financial relationship with the placement organizations and no knowledge of payment structures. He's lying. We believe so. But he gave us everything else in detail, which makes his denial of the contracts conspicuous in a way that's actually useful. She thought about that, because a man who admits to 7 years of obstruction and 37 suppressed complaints, but claims no knowledge of the financial structure attached to the same program, is a man who's specifically protecting the financial structure. Exactly. And his attorney is experienced enough to know that, which means this denial is a strategic choice, not an oversight. Which means they've calculated that the financial exposure is bigger than everything else combined. Is it? Holt was quiet for a moment. The forensics team finished the first pass trace this morning. The procurement architecture is significant. We're talking about a multi-year contracting relationship with fraudulent certifications, federal funds involved, and at least one placement organization that we believe was established specifically to receive military animal placements under these agreements. If the full trace confirms what we're seeing, the financial charges would exceed the obstruction charges by a considerable margin. Who established the organization? Another pause. That's what we're still building, but we found a name in the incorporation records that we're pursuing. Aldridge's name? No, someone above him. She hadn't let herself think past Aldridge. She did now, and it was not a comfortable place to think. How far above? We don't know yet. The incorporation was run through a shell in Delaware. We're working with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit to pierce it. He paused. This is going to get larger before it concludes. I want you to know that. Okay, she said. Are you okay? I'm eating lunch, she said. I'll be okay. The rest of Monday passed without visible incident. Voss texted at 4:30. Surgery went well. They decompressed the disc. He's in recovery, responsive. She read it and put her phone down and sat for a moment in the particular relief of an outcome going the right direction. At 5, the DCIS field office released a brief statement to the regional press confirming an active investigation into military animal evaluation practices and federal contracting compliance, and naming Raymond Sutter as a suspended evaluator under investigation. The statement did not name Aldridge. It did not name Claire. It gave nothing away except the existence of the investigation, which was enough. By 6, she'd received 4 texts from numbers she didn't recognize, 2 asking if she was the witness mentioned in news reports, 1 that appeared to be misdirected to her number, and 1 that was simply, "Thank you." No name. She didn't know who had sent it or what they were thanking her for specifically, and she wasn't sure it mattered. She drove home in the dark. Tuesday morning arrived with a phone call at 6:40 that she almost didn't answer because the number was unfamiliar and she'd reached her threshold for unknown numbers. She answered on the 4th ring. Ms. Maddox. A man's voice, measured with the particular smoothness of someone accustomed to professional communication. My name is Gerald Ashton. I'm legal counsel representing Colonel Marcus Aldridge. She sat up. You should be calling Special Agent Holt. I've spoken with Agent Holt. I'm calling you independently with the full awareness of my client. A brief pause, precise as everything else about his delivery. Colonel Aldridge has asked me to communicate something to you directly. She waited. He acknowledges that your reports were accurate. He acknowledges that the actions taken to suppress them were his decisions, made under instructions he received from an authority he believed to be legitimate, and that those instructions were ultimately self-serving rather than institutional. A pause. He wants you to know that. His attorney is telling me this? He asked me to. He said, Ashton paused again, and this pause had a different quality. He said you spent 9 years doing the right thing through proper channels, and the proper channels failed you, and that the failure was by design. He said he was part of the design, and he understands that acknowledgement changes nothing practical, but he wanted you to have it directly, rather than through an investigative report. She was quiet for a long moment. The kitchen was cold. She'd forgotten to turn the heat up. Why? She asked. Not why he was acknowledging it. She understood that. Why did he suppress them? What were the instructions? I can't speak to that in detail outside of the formal process, Ashton said. What I can tell you is that my client was not the originating authority. He was a mechanism and a structure that he understood imperfectly and controlled less than he believed. Someone above him told him to suppress complaints. Ashton didn't confirm or deny. My client is prepared to provide a full accounting of the instructions he received, the source of those instructions, and the specific communications involved. He will do so in the formal investigative process. He's giving them the name, Claire said. He's giving them everything, Ashton said. And then, more quietly, he said to tell you that you were right, and that he's sorry it took this long for the right people to say so. She held the phone for a moment after he hung up. The kitchen was cold and gray and ordinary, and she sat in it with the weight of 9 years pressing on her from one side and the specific lightness of being told you were right, pressing from the other, and neither of them was comfortable, and both of them were real. She turned the heat up. Bart, Holt called at 9. Aldridge gave us the name. She'd been waiting for it since Ashton's call. Who? Brigadier General Thomas Ray. He retired from the Army 18 months ago. The corporation established to receive military animal placements was incorporated 14 months ago, 1 month after his retirement. The timing was not subtle. He left the service and immediately set up the structure to monetize the program he'd been running. We believe so. Ray was 2 levels above Aldridge in the chain of command. He had oversight authority over the Military Animal Program Administration, the contracting office, and the veterinary evaluation system. When Aldridge received instructions to suppress complaints, those instructions originated with Ray. And now Ray is a private citizen running a nonprofit animal placement organization. 2 of them, Holt said, with federal contracts that renewed automatically at the start of each fiscal year. We're pulling those contracts now. She thought about what Aldridge had built. The 37 suppressed complaints, the fabricated review records, the false paper trail designed to protect a structure that existed specifically to direct military animals, animals certified healthy by a compromised evaluator, into placement organizations that paid back into a retired general's pocket. Is he aware of the investigation? She asked. He was informed this morning that the DCIS is requesting his records under the expanded scope authorization. His attorney responded within the hour with a statement asserting full cooperation. Holt's tone carried a specific dryness. We've heard that before this week. What's his exposure? Federal procurement fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy? If the financial trace confirms what we're seeing, we're looking at charges that carry significant federal sentencing guidelines. She exhaled. Okay. Claire. He said it the way he'd said it when he was about to give her something he meant. We're filing for arrest warrants for both Sutter and Ray this afternoon. Aldridge is cooperating under a formal agreement. The case is going forward. She looked out her kitchen window. A Tuesday in November. The street was ordinary. The mountains were visible this morning, just barely at the edge of the horizon. And Aldridge, she said. What happens to him? That's between his attorney and the federal prosecutor. His cooperation is significant. The sentencing recommendation will reflect that. Holt paused. It won't be nothing, but it will be less than Ray. He spent 7 years destroying people's reports. Yes, Holt said. He did. She didn't argue for a harsher outcome and didn't argue for leniency. That part wasn't hers to determine. She understood the limits of her role. She'd always understood them. And this was one of them. What do you need from me? She asked. We need you to come in for a final formal statement on Thursday. Review your documentation, confirm the timeline, sign the record. After that, he paused. After that, you've done what you needed to do. She nodded, which he couldn't see. Thursday, she said. One more thing, Holt said, and his voice changed in a way she recognized as significant. The review board session that was stayed, the emergency session Aldridge's source triggered to challenge your credibility. We identified the source. Who? Dr. Philip Greer, Holt said. He received a phone call Saturday morning from a number traced to Aldridge's former aide-de-camp. Greer provided a statement to the review board asserting concerns about your professional conduct at Harlow Peak. She sat very still. He's not being charged, Holt said quickly. There's no evidence he understood the full context. He received a call from someone who framed it as a professional concern, and he provided a statement he believed was routine. But he was used as a source. She thought about Greer's phone call through the partially closed door. She's been here 18 months, and I never had any reason to think. The voice of a man who had filed her under adequate and then been asked to confirm she was problematic, and had obliged, because obliging was what Greer did when the ask came from a direction that felt authoritative. She wasn't angry. She was tired. Does he know? She asked. He was informed this morning. How did he take it? A pause. Apparently he's been in his office with the door closed since 9. She thought about the world's okayest vet mug, the peeling linoleum, the flickering light above the triage station that nobody had fixed in 6 weeks. I'll talk to him, she said. You don't have to. I know, she said. I'll talk to him anyway. She hung up, put on her coat, and drove to work. Greer was in his office with the door closed, exactly as Holt had described. She knocked once and opened it without waiting for an answer, because waiting for an answer from Greer was a good way to not get one. He was at his desk. He looked like a man who'd spent the morning discovering something about himself that he hadn't particularly wanted to know. I didn't understand what I was doing, he said, before she could say anything. I know, she said. That's not... He stopped. It's not an excuse. No, she said. It's not. But it's true, and that matters. He looked at her with the expression of a man who'd prepared for a harder conversation and wasn't sure what to do with this one. Are you going to... Is there something I should... No, Claire said. There's nothing you need to do. The investigation is where it is. Greer, she paused, choosing. The mistake you made was believing that adequate information from a credible-sounding source was enough. It usually is. It wasn't this time. He said nothing. She turned to leave. Maddox, he said. She stopped. I reviewed your clinical notes last week, all 18 months. He said it carefully, like he was still deciding whether to finish the thought. You're not adequate. She looked back at him. His face was doing something complicated, the particular complexity of a person correcting a record he'd maintained too long. I know, she said. And she left. She was in the east corridor, heading to the medication cabinet, when her phone buzzed. A text from Farrell. Arrest warrant signed. Sutter and Ray in custody as of 11 a.m. Formal charges filed. Ray's attorney is contesting. Thought you should know before it hits the news. She stopped walking. Read it again. Then she put her phone in her pocket and kept moving, because the Shepherd mix in Bay 2 needed his drain assessed, and the Labrador intake from yesterday had a post-op check at noon, and the work didn't stop because the right thing had finally happened. But something in her chest, some piece of compressed architecture that had been braced for impact for 7 years, shifted very slightly toward something that felt almost like rest. And then her phone buzzed again, this time a call from a number she didn't recognize, and when she answered, a woman's voice said, Ms. Maddox, this is Colonel Renata Osei, Office of the Inspector General. We've been asked to conduct a formal review of the complaint suppression timeline, and we've been told you're the person who can help us understand where it actually started. Claire stopped walking, because she knew Renata Osei's name. Not from her time in the service, and not from the investigation. From the list of senior officers who had received a copy of her third complaint in November 2020. The complaint that was supposedly never delivered. How do you know my name? Claire asked. Because I've known it since November 2020, Osei said. When your third complaint arrived in my office through a routing error that turned out not to be an error. Claire stood in the east corridor and did not move. What does that mean? It means someone in Aldridge's administrative chain made a mistake when they pulled your report. They caught it. They thought they caught it, but a copy had already auto-forwarded to the IG's distribution list before the suppression process completed. A pause. I received a partial copy of your third complaint 4 years ago. It was incomplete. Several attachments were missing, and by the time I tried to trace the original, it had been removed from the system. You knew 4 years ago. I knew something existed that shouldn't have been removed. I didn't have enough to act on. I opened an internal file and I waited. Another pause, this one longer. I'm sorry that waiting cost what it cost. Claire exhaled through her nose. The corridor smelled like antiseptic and the faint metallic undertone of the heating system cycling on. You're calling me now because Aldridge gave them Ray. I'm calling you because Ray's attorney filed a motion this morning asserting that the investigation's primary witness has a documented history of inaccurate complaint filing, Osei said. He's going to use the manufactured review records, the ones your investigators are working to debunk, to argue that your reports were assessed and rejected on their merits and that the current investigation was initiated on a compromised evidentiary foundation. The metadata disproves the manufactured records. The metadata is in process. Ray's attorney is moving on Monday. We need to move before Monday. What do you need from me? Your complete timeline, from the first evaluation you flagged in 2019 through the contact you received last week. I need it in writing, signed, with supporting documentation by Friday. A pause. I also need you to know that the IG's office is formally opening a parallel review of the complaint suppression as a systemic institutional failure. That review will be public record. Public record, she held that. The manufactured documents will be addressed within the public review, Osei said. Ray's attorney can file whatever motions he chooses. He cannot file them against a formally published Inspector General finding. It was clean in a way that the rest of the week hadn't been. The IG's public review would establish the institutional record of what happened to the 37 complaints, including hers, in a format that Ray's legal team couldn't suppress, couldn't contest through private motion, and couldn't reframe as a credibility dispute about a single witness. Because it wouldn't be about a single witness. It would be about the system, documented by the office with authority to document it. I'll have it to you by Thursday, Claire said. Friday is sufficient. Thursday, she said. Let's not give anyone extra time. Tick. She wrote it that night and the next night, at the kitchen table with the heat finally working properly, drafting the full timeline in the same precise, undecorated language she'd always used. Dates, observations, specific words from specific conversations. She didn't editorialize. She didn't characterize. She stated what she saw, what she did, what happened, and what didn't happen, and she let the sequence carry its own weight because the sequence was damning enough without assistance. She sent it to Osei at 11:15 Thursday night. 43 pages. 7 attachments. The complete record of 9 years compressed into a document that should have existed in an official filing cabinet since 2019 and instead had lived in a plastic storage box behind a winter coat. Osei responded at 11:50 with 3 words. Received. Thank you. Claire closed her laptop and went to bed and slept for 7 hours without waking, which was the longest she'd slept in 2 weeks. Kodiak came home on Friday. Voss drove back from Casper with the dog in the rear seat on a foam pad, and he pulled into the Harlow Peak lot at 2 in the afternoon because he wanted Claire to do the first post-operative assessment. He hadn't called ahead. He'd sent a text that said, "Coming in at 2. He should see you first." She was ready. The dog came out of the vehicle slowly, with the careful deliberateness of an animal navigating new proprioception, the surgical site still shaved and slightly swollen beneath the bandaging. He moved on all 4 legs. There was a hesitation in his left rear still. There would be for months, the nerve pathways relearning their signals. But he moved, and when Claire crouched in the parking lot and held out her hand, he covered the distance to her without being asked. He pressed his nose against her palm, hard, deliberate, the same way he had the first morning. "Hey," she said. He didn't do anything dramatic. He just stood there. She ran her hand along his flank, assessed his weight distribution, checked the bandaging, and noted that his eyes were clear and tracking normally, and his respiration was even. She looked up at Voss. "He's good," she said. Voss was watching the dog with the expression of a man who had been holding tension in his jaw for 3 weeks, and was only now becoming aware of it. "Yeah," he said. His voice was rougher than usual. She got Kodiak settled in the recovery bay with water and a clean pad, and Voss sat on the bench outside, and she sat beside him because there was nothing urgent demanding her attention for exactly 20 minutes, and she knew how to recognize the rare moments when that was true. "I heard about Ray," Voss said. "It's moving fast now. How are you?" She thought about it honestly instead of reflexively. "I keep waiting for something else to go wrong," she said. "That's probably just a habit at this point. Probably takes a while to unlearn. Probably." He looked at his hands. 9 years of reports that went nowhere. And then one dog comes through a door, and you're suddenly the person everyone needed to find. That's not... She stopped. It wasn't the dog that started it. The dog was just the thing that made Sutter's pattern visible to someone outside the system. "You started it," Voss said. "In 2019. She didn't argue with him. It was true, and she'd spent a long time in relationships with true things that she didn't know how to accept gracefully. "Thank you," he said, "for what you did for him, for what you're doing in general. I know that's insufficient." "It's not insufficient," she said. "It's enough." The Inspector General's preliminary findings were published on the following Wednesday. Claire read them on her lunch break on her phone, sitting in the break room with the same cold coffee problem she'd been failing to solve for 18 months. The document was 47 pages and written in the specific dense language of Federal Institutional Review, and she read all of it. It named the suppression structure. It named Aldridge. It named the 37 complaints, listed by filing date and classification, and noted that each had been intercepted and processed through a false review mechanism designed to generate the appearance of legitimate assessment without producing one. It documented the administrative chain through which the suppression operated, and it identified the originating authority for the suppression instructions as Brigadier General Thomas Ray, USA, retired. It also noted, in a subsection that Claire read 3 times, that the original complaint filings demonstrated consistent clinical accuracy and that the concerns raised therein had been subsequently validated by independent veterinary assessment of the affected animals. That in the opinion of the reviewing office, the complaints represented a good faith effort by a qualified medical professional to engage legitimate institutional channels, and that the failure was not with the complaints, but with the channels. She put her phone down. The break room was the same break room it had always been. The same chipped counter, the same coffee maker that took 4 minutes longer than it should, the same window that looked out onto the parking lot and the highway and the edge of the Rockies. None of it had changed. She was sitting in exactly the same place she'd sat 3 weeks ago before any of this started. The difference was in the record. The record now said what actually happened. She drank her cold coffee and went back to work. The charges came down publicly 2 days later. Raymond Sutter, federal fraud, falsification of official records, conspiracy. His veterinary license was suspended by the state board pending the outcome of the criminal case, with a formal revocation hearing scheduled for January. Thomas Ray, federal procurement fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy to obstruct a federal investigation, and misuse of federal contracting authority. His 2 placement organizations had their federal contracts immediately suspended and were placed under receivership pending financial audit. His attorney's motion to challenge the investigation's evidentiary foundation was denied by the federal court on the grounds that the Inspector General's published findings constituted independent corroboration that superseded the challenged witness testimony. That last part was the one Claire reread most carefully. The motion was denied. Ray's attempt to dismantle the case by dismantling her had failed, specifically because Osei's office had published findings that stood independently of anything Claire had said. She hadn't won because she'd outmaneuvered anyone. She'd won because the documentation was true, and the truth, when enough independent institutions were looking at it, held. Marcus Aldridge entered a formal cooperation agreement and pleaded guilty to obstruction of a federal investigation and abuse of administrative authority. His sentencing was deferred pending the conclusion of the broader case. He would not walk away clean. But the record of his cooperation would be considered, and whatever the court decided, it would be proportionate in the way that institutional consequences rarely were when the institution was protecting itself rather than accounting for itself. She didn't feel triumphant about Aldridge. She felt something closer to tired acknowledgement. He had spent 7 years as the wall between her truth and the people who could act on it, and he had also been, in his own way, a mechanism rather than an architect. And the distinction mattered, not because it absolved him, but because understanding the machinery clearly was more useful than satisfying anger. The architect was Ray, and Ray was facing federal prison. She was restocking Bay 3 the following Monday when Holt came in without Farrell, which was unusual enough to make her look up. He was holding a manila envelope. "The formal case documentation is complete," he said. "Your role as a witness is concluded. I wanted to bring you the final confirmation in person." She took the envelope. "And the case?" "Moving to prosecution. Sutter has indicated he'll take a plea. Ray is contesting everything, which will take time, but the financial trace is complete and the evidence is substantial." He paused. "Farrell wanted me to tell you she wishes she'd been able to work a case like this earlier in her career. She said to tell you that specifically." Claire looked at the envelope. "Tell her I said the same about her." Holt almost smiled. Not quite, but the edges of it were there. "There's something else. The IG's office has recommended a formal citation, a recognition of the original complaints as a documented example of appropriate professional conduct under adverse institutional conditions. It will be part of the public record." "A citation? Your name, attached to a formal finding that says you were right and the system failed you." He looked at her directly. "It's not the same as an apology, I know that." "No," she said. "But it's real." He nodded. "It's real." She put the envelope under her arm. "Is there anything else you need from me?" "No," he said. "We have everything." He extended his hand and she shook it, which was not a particularly dramatic conclusion to 3 weeks that had compressed 7 years, but it was the honest one. He left. She put the envelope in her locker and finished restocking Bay 3. Kodiak came in for his 2-week post-operative check on a Friday afternoon at the end of November. He walked through the front door without hesitation. The reception area, which had been the location of his first appearance in the facility, he navigated with the careful deliberateness of a dog whose proprioception was still resettling but whose confidence had returned. He acknowledged Marcus with the particular tolerance of an animal who had decided someone was acceptable. He let Tira give him a piece of the dog treat she kept behind the desk, which she gave to every dog she liked, and she apparently liked Kodiak now. Claire examined him in Bay 2. The surgical site was healing well. No signs of infection, appropriate scar tissue formation, nerve function returning measurably on the left rear. She put him through a basic movement assessment and watched him track her instructions with the focused precision of an animal that had been trained to give everything it had to every task. "He's ahead of the recovery curve," she told Voss. "Another 4 weeks before full activity clearance, but he's ahead. They said 6 to 8 weeks minimum." "He's a motivated patient." She scratched behind Kodiak's ear, which he allowed in the specific way he allowed things now. Not resigned, but chosen. "He wants to get back to work." "He's retired," Voss said. "Tell him that." Voss looked at the dog, and the dog looked at Voss, and the look between them had the particular density of a relationship that had survived things most relationships didn't. "What happens now?" Voss asked. "For you, I mean, after all of this." She'd been thinking about that, not with anxiety. She was past the point where the future felt like something that required bracing for, but with the genuine open consideration of someone who had spent so long managing an ongoing problem that the absence of it left actual space. "I stay here," she said. "For now." "For now?" Osei's office asked if I'd be willing to consult on the systemic review. The complaint suppression affected programs beyond the veterinary evaluation system. There are similar structures in other departments that they want to assess. She wants someone who understands what the failure looks like from the inside. You'd be working for the IG's office. Consulting, part-time. It wouldn't replace this. She looked around the bay. I like this work. I'm not leaving it. Voss nodded slowly. You'd be the person who catches the things that fall through. I'd be the person who knows where to look, she said. There's a difference. He thought about that. Is there anyone doing this already? Catching this kind of thing before it gets to where yours got? Some, she said. Not enough. Mostly people who figured it out the same way I did, by having it happen to them and deciding that wasn't sufficient. Seems like a hard way to build a system. It's the only way systems learn, she said. Someone has to be the one who got to the edge and didn't go over, and then turns around and puts up a marker that says, this is where the ground stops, so the next person doesn't have to find it the same way. Kodiak shifted his weight and leaned against her leg. Not neediness. He wasn't that kind of dog. More like acknowledgement. She put her hand on his back and felt him settle under it. He'd have been in chronic pain for the rest of his life, Voss said quietly. If you hadn't brought him in and refused to leave without an answer, she said. You were the answer. I was one of them. She straightened up. The records were the answer. Doubt's email was the answer. Ose receiving a partial copy of a report someone tried to delete was the answer. It took all of it. Voss looked at her with the expression of a man who wanted to argue and couldn't find the right lever. You're not going to take credit for any of this, are you? I'm going to take exactly as much as is accurate, she said. Which is some of it. Just not all of it. He shook his head slightly. Not disagreement, something closer to recognition. Is that a military thing? No, she said. It's a true thing. The citation from the IG's office arrived by certified mail the first week of December. It was a single sheet of formal letterhead bearing the seal of the Department of Defense Inspector General's office, and it stated in the precise and deliberate language of institutional record that the complaint filing submitted by Claire Maddox between February 2019 and November 2020 had been reviewed by the Office of the Inspector General in connection with its formal investigation into systemic complaint suppression within the Military Animal Program Administration. And that said, filings had been found to represent accurate clinical assessment and appropriate professional conduct, and that the adverse treatment of those filings constituted a documented institutional failure for which the responsible parties had been identified and held to account. It was not an apology. It didn't have the word sorry in it anywhere. It was a federal document, and federal documents didn't apologize. They established record. But the record said she was right. The record said the failure was the system's, not hers. The record said her name accurately in a document that would exist in the public archive for as long as public archives existed. She stood in her kitchen and held it for a while. Then she put it in the plastic storage box, the one from the hardware store with the locking lid, alongside the folders and the notes and the form letters and the emails, because that was where her documentation lived, and this was documentation, and it belonged with the rest of the record she'd built. She closed the lid. She didn't need to look at it again. It wasn't going anywhere. The thing about doing the right thing inside a broken system is that nobody tells you how long it takes. Nobody gives you a timeline or a guarantee or a reasonable expectation of when the weight you've been carrying is going to be distributed to the people who should have been carrying it all along. You file the report. You get the form letter. You file another one. You get another form letter. You watch the letters go into a system that was quietly arranged to produce letters and nothing else. And somewhere in that process, you make a decision, not once, but repeatedly, almost daily, about whether the truth you're holding is worth the cost of continuing to hold it. Claire had made that decision dozens of times over 9 years, and she had not always made it gracefully. There had been nights in Kandahar, and nights in Texas, and nights in this rental house in Denton Falls, Wyoming, when she'd sat with the full weight of what she knew and what it was costing her to know it, and she had not felt strong. She had felt tired and isolated and genuinely uncertain that anything she was doing was going to matter. That was the part that didn't make it into the citation, the part that wasn't in the public record, the hundreds of ordinary moments in which she had simply decided to keep the documentation current and keep showing up to work and keep treating every patient with the same precision she'd always used, because the alternative letting the weight make her smaller, was the one thing she refused. She had not been perfect. She had been difficult and abrasive, and she had held herself at a distance from people that sometimes made her lonelier than was necessary. She had made the mistake of assuming that adequate was what she deserved because it was what she'd been told she was. And she'd had to spend 18 months at a clinic in Wyoming relearning that the ceiling other people put on her was not a measurement. But she had kept the documentation. She had kept it accurate and current and complete. And when the right moment finally arrived, the documentation had done what truth does when it's handled carefully. It held. The last Friday before Christmas, Greer knocked on the break room door while she was eating an actual lunch at an actual reasonable hour, which had become possible now that the investigators had finished using the conference room and the facility had returned to its ordinary rhythms. He came in without being invited, which was unusual for him. He was carrying 2 coffees from the place down the road, the good coffees, in the paper cups with the cardboard sleeves, not the facility's institutional coffee, which had never been adequate. He set one down in front of her. She looked at it, then at him. "I called that review board," he said. "I told someone I had concerns about your professional conduct, and I didn't understand what I was walking into, and I did damage that could have—" He stopped. He tried again. "I'm sorry." He said it like it cost him. Because it did. Greer was not a man who apologized easily, not because he was cruel, but because he was the particular kind of person who managed discomfort by not looking at it directly, and looking at this directly was requiring effort she could see in every line of his face. "You were used," she said. It doesn't excuse it," she agreed. "But it's true. And you've known it for 3 weeks, and it's been sitting on you, and I'm telling you now that I'm not carrying it, so you shouldn't either." She picked up the coffee. "Thank you for this." He sat down across from her, which was a first. He had his own coffee, and he didn't say anything for a moment, and she let the silence be what it was. "You're better than I hired for," he said finally. "Yes," she said. "I am." He almost smiled. It was the most honest exchange they'd ever had, and it had taken 18 months and a federal investigation to get there, which felt about right for 2 people who were both, in their own ways, more comfortable with precision than with vulnerability. "The IG's office," he said. "The consulting work." "Part-time," she said. "I'm staying here." He nodded once. It was not quite relief, but it was adjacent to it. "Good," he said. And then, because Greer didn't belabor things when the essential had been said, "The light above the triage station. I ordered the replacement fixture." She looked at him. "It's been 6 weeks." "7," he said, "but it's ordered." She drank her coffee and didn't argue with the timeline, because some things moved slowly, and the important thing was that they moved. Kodiak cleared full activity status in January. Voss sent her a video without context, just a clip, 20 seconds, of a Belgian Malinois running a full sprint across a snow-dusted field in the early morning light, moving with the fluid, explosive speed of an animal that had been built for this and had gotten it back. Kodiak hit the end of the field, turned, and came back at the same pace. And somewhere off camera, Voss whistled once, low, and the dog came to him and sat. And even in the compressed video, Claire could see the quality of the stillness. Not pain management stillness, not compensation, just the clean presence of an animal that was no longer carrying something it couldn't name. She watched it twice. Then she put her phone in her pocket and went back to the triage station, where the new light fixture was installed and working, casting the corridor in clean, even light that made everything exactly as visible as it needed to be. She had a full intake assessment waiting, and a post-op check at 11, and a consult call with OC's office at 2 about the review methodology for a complaint suppression audit in a separate program she hadn't worked in but understood structurally. The day was full in the ordinary way that days were full when the emergency had passed and the work remained. Not glamorous, not resolved into some simplified version of itself, just present and ongoing and requiring her full attention. She gave it that. Because the things she'd learned, not in the service, not in 9 years of documentation, but in the accumulated weight of every morning she'd come back to work when leaving would have been easier, was that strength wasn't the absence of being underestimated. It was what you built in the space they left you. When they looked away because they decided you didn't matter, they leave you alone. They stop watching. They assume the ceiling holds. And in that space, quietly, without asking for permission or recognition, you build the thing that outlasts them. You keep the documentation current. You treat every patient with precision. You stay. And when the moment arrives, and it does arrive, not always, not for everyone, but it arrives, you are ready because you never stopped being ready. Because you understood long before anyone else did that the work was never about being seen. It was about being true. That was enough. That had always been enough.